Hey, welcome to the next in the Human-Centric Cybersecurity Partnerships series of webinars. We're very excited for today's presentation. We're looking forward to all of your interesting and exciting questions. Of course, they will be answered towards the end, but we will take them throughout the session. So if something occurs to you that you'd like more information on, or you would like to make a comment, please do that in the chat as it occurs to you, and we will come to that towards the end. Today we are welcoming two of our co-investigators, Drs. Besma Momani and Shali Gai-Bahaj, and I really hope I haven't butchered that. Besma Momani is an Associate Vice President of International and Full Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo, as well as a Senior Fellow for the Center of International Governance, Innovation and Non-Resident Fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute. She's a Fulbright Scholar and award-winning author of more than a dozen books. And if you've seen her before, it's probably because she frequently provides expert commentary on global affairs and political economy of the Middle East. Shelley is a postdoctoral fellow with Dr. Momani, and she examines identity, democracy, disinformation, and social media. And graduating from the University of Toronto, her comparative political research stuff's really interesting and covers topics that I really don't understand very well, such as ethno-nationalist mobilization, political party strategy, and South Asian politics. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Shelley and Dr. Momani for their presentation. So without further ado, please welcome our presenters.
Thank you. So welcome, everybody. It's a bit hard to speak to folks that you don't see, but I'm hoping there are people out there. So hello. So thank you very much. This is a really great opportunity for Shelley and I to present some of our research. Shelley has had also the opportunity and great success in presenting this to the Foreign Interference Committee, and I'm sure she'll talk about some of that as well. But the focus for us today is really focusing on the spread and impact of digital disinformation in diasporic communities. And I'd love to just spend a little bit of time trying to go over some of the genesis of this proposal and idea and how we are effectively trying to do research on this subject. Okay, so very simply, I think one of the things that we really wanted to do was provide a very, I think it's a neat proposal and methodology on trying to uncover something that is quite big in its capacity to impact a lot of us, not just, I think, in democracies, but all around the world. So our research focus, and we'll look at some of the definitions and what we mean by private digital spaces. We'll go over our research design and methodology, really give you a sense of what is the digital information landscape for diasporic communities. A little bit about definitions too. Diasporic communities is one that, again, is not a term that everybody loves. I personally love ethnocultural communities, but Shelley and I, this is a sentiment of long conversation, was, certainly I think a lot of folks are using diasporic communities as well. And we'll talk about the spread of disinformation, which is what we're really focusing on, particularly on chat apps. Some of what we think are the responses to that, impacts, implications, and where we think this is going as a field of study. So we had a simple question, but not as simple as it looks, because methodologically we wanted to make sure that we could triangulate and think about many different ways of ensuring that this is a tight methodological study. And the question was, why and how does mis and disinformation spread within private and encrypted digital spaces? And most importantly, I think we were, after our first phase of our topic, and I'm really grateful to the funding that we received from Heritage Canada to do this, our first investigation was really the sort of what is out there, what kind of disinformation is it, and then we went into the next phase of, how does it spread, which is another totally different issue. And then also we really wanted to get at what I think we're all thinking of, which is what are the impacts? And I think one of the things that we really felt was clear, and this is some of maybe both Shelley and I's own personal experiences coming from ethnocultural communities, where I come from the Arab Middle Eastern community, Shelley come from the Indo community, and has studied this even way longer than I have ever had, as well, through her own research on social media and connections between India and Canada. we both experienced this of what we called, not just the crazy uncle. Increasingly, it's the mainstream, family members sharing things with us that was just really pretty outrageous, and mostly in what we're going to talk about, which is this private and encrypted digital spaces. So it's not your Twitter and it's not your Facebook, which are public. And at one point, one had the API to do some really interesting investigations in those platforms. This was a really more hidden, I think, unexplored black box that we wanted to open. So some just quick conceptual stuff. Certainly, I think we all have heard this before. What's the difference between misinformation, disinformation, malinformation? Certainly, we all know that one is about intent, and one is, I think, we also have this real big challenge, I think, methodologically. Trying to prove that this is an intentional policy, particularly from usually rogue actors and foreign governments. And I think I guess it's a bit of a side note. I do think we get hung up on this distinction, and it can be to our own detriment because we really get really hung up on. And I get that as social scientists, as good social scientists in particular, we want to be very precise with our words. But it does mean that often we can't prove, for example, that Russia, or even to be more exact, Putin, who we assume is sort of behind a lot of the thinking of what is coming out there, really intends to, pollute the environment and impact, or the information environment, and impact various communities, even though we can obviously assume that. But that's the kind of challenge we face with that kind of distinction of definitions. Nevertheless, I think when we focus on impact, that's sort of regardless, and the impact is the constant, and does not make a difference whether it's dis, or malinformation. It's all impacting, and I think we definitely see a lot of negative impacts as a result. Okay, again, something else that both Shelley and I discovered with our own, again, respective ethnocultural communities, and for those who are on this webinar that similarly come from a lot of these, ethnocultural communities, you'll know that, WhatsApp is just universal. I mean, I think people when I travel in the Middle East, and I know Shelley's shared the same when she travels to India, is that people don't share their phone number or their email. They just share their WhatsApp. It's the mode of communication. And that is, again, important to point out that it stands apart. So we know that ethnocultural communities, and particularly newcomers, by far outuse WhatsApp compared to all other, and let's say, Canadian communities that have been here longer than some of the newcomers and these, minority ethnocultural communities. So we know that it is a more used tool. Of course, WeChat in the Chinese communities is kind of the equivalent. And these private spaces are really difficult to unpack and expose because they are private. They're in theory encrypted, although I think we all know that really they're not, based on some new investigations of how they've been cracked open by a lot of autocratic and movements. But nevertheless, one doesn't have a full, insight into what's happening in these spaces. So that obviously proves a methodological challenge for us. So one of the things we first started was actually using an original survey, and we worked with the South Asian community, Chinese community, and the Arab community. Those are the top three communities of newcomers, so we thought that was very relevant. And they're also the fastest growing as well. Admittedly, we did try to investigate the Filipino community as well, and we just had some real challenges in getting a real large sample size, so we unfortunately had to abandon that. Really, I think methodologically, this is something that I love to do and done so in previous work of mine with ethnocultural communities, is to go to them. So just if you're curious, one way we did this in thinking about where do we set up quite literally our surveys is we went to ethnocultural grocery stores. So we went to where do communities of these communities buy their food. And we worked within Kitchener-Waterloo because it's known to be representative sample of much of the country in terms of the ethnocultural mix of a medium-sized city, and also very manageable for us, particularly because all of our RAs were in Waterloo, so it made things quite easy. After that, we also did semi-structured focus group discussions with members from these communities, and that was facilitated by some of the same communities that also helped us in our first study with identifying the actual types of disinformation that is exposed. And of course, we also followed up with those who filled out the survey, which was also very enriching. If you can't tell right now, this is a very expensive study because, and I always say that because I'm hoping that there are grad students on the webinar, and it's always really useful to just really be very honest about what it takes, and maybe for funders to know that this does cost money. Not just, of course, we had to provide a gift certificate of some sort to get people incentivized to fill out a survey, but also you can imagine lots of research assistants to go to these various stores and to talk to people about filling out the survey. So that's something else we had to do. Very quickly, and then I'll turn to my colleague to take over, is really talking about having a chance to talk to these folks about what is the type of apps that they use. We know that there's a lot happening again in that background. WhatsApp is one that's really, again, very popular in these communities, but it's not the only one. Certainly in the Chinese community, absolutely, WeChat has the equivalence to WhatsApp. And there are certainly private chats in some of the other more public chats. So, Twitter is used, but if you have, and just a plug here for someone who left Twitter more than almost 2 years ago, please go to Blue Sky. It's a nicer place. That you can have DMs within Twitter. And so the DMs are, again, that's the private aspect of some of these spaces. And similarly with Instagram. So there's a lot of side chat that happens, if you will, and sharing of information in those private spaces that are a part of a public space. But certainly, again, WhatsApp is a really high number. When we ask them, where do you get most of your information about everything from news, we tend to find that actually there's a big usage of, again, Instagram, WeChat, WhatsApp, and Twitter, and the rest. And most importantly, there is a high degree of trust in these spaces, which I think, again, anyone who is on these apps also feels, I don't know, maybe it's being critical of the information environment and feel like a lot of it is not very, trustworthy messaging. Our communities do think that the news that they're seeing is relatively of trust. And I think that's really very interesting for us to watch. And I'll turn it over to Shelley.
Thanks, Besma. That was a comprehensive kind of introduction to some of our research. So thank you for that. And what we really wanted to explore in the survey is how and why disinformation spreads on these chats. So we started with some basic questions, kind of asking, is mis and disinformation observed in these apps? And it's interesting that 41.8% of respondents say they think they have observed mis and disinformation, while 31.6 are certain they have observed mis and disinformation. So if you combine those two categories, it's quite a chunk of users who say they have observed some form of mis and disinformation. So that kind of confirmed the idea that mis and disinformation is in fact circulating in these digital spaces. We also wanted to ask about the frequency of mis and disinformation content observed in these platforms. And what we found is there's about 46.5% who observe it from observing it daily to around 1 or 2 times per week. So again, it is pretty frequently observed in these digital spaces. And then we also wanted to kind of gauge and understand what kind of mis and disinformation content they're seeing. What are the sort of subjects and topics that are covered? And most mis and disinformation observed in these digital spaces relates to international global affairs and politics of other countries. And that's really sort of underscores the idea that these digital spaces are inherently transnational. Information circulates across hard borders, and diaspora communities are consuming information from these kind of multiple layered embedded information environments, including information environments from their home countries, but also from elsewhere. And it's the idea that sort of it's like a free market of exchange of information in these digital spaces. And the chat group is really this transnational ecosystem for information to flow across what we typically understand as state boundaries. Another kind of interesting finding is that there was also a lot of mis and disinformation content relating to local and community news, especially when we compare that to, let's say, topics on the Canadian federal government and politics. And that's interesting because it also suggests where kind of adversarial threat actors may pick up certain topics and leverage certain areas of interest to circulate and construct kind of strategic narratives and pollute the information environment through the spread of mis and disinformation content. And some of these pictures that we shared are actually from the data set from our first phase of our project, where we actually collected mis and disinformation content circulating on the chat apps. Two are related to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then one is kind of representative of like sort of a lighthearted memes or like a satire comedy kind of critique of American foreign policy. And what we found in the research is that these places are quite complex. And they're complex for a number of reasons. These chat groups often involve familial, interpersonal, and professional community groups. So they're really interpersonal networks of communication, but they're also large and open public groups. And so there's not always that personal connection that we assume in these chat groups. And in fact, in our research, about 79% responded that they do belong to chat groups where they don't actually know everyone in the chat group. And again, that suggests that there are these more vulnerable groups within these digital spaces that can be maybe more susceptible to the spread of mis and disinformation. That's because in these larger public chat groups, there's reduced accountability and the kind of propensity or inclination for anonymous or semi-anonymous information sharing. There are fewer mechanisms for content moderation through chat group administrators and group admins, as well as like communities kind of checking on each other and saying, hey, that's not true, or this is true. There's also kind of the potential for the exploitation of these kind of chat groups to use for trial ballooning of messages, of disinformation campaigns and information operations. And of course, there's also the idea of repetitive exposure, that mis and disinformation can circulate on these public chat groups and then make their way into interpersonal communications or one-to-one chat or small private chat groups. And it's the idea that the more you see certain information, it's often the case that the more true and credible it seems. And that's why that strategy of astroturfing with mis and disinformation spread and the spread of computational propaganda is often so effective, because it makes that topic seem like it's being discussed by everyone when it's actually kind of more of a niche topic. And it also, again, underscores the transnational dimension of these spaces. These are transnational networks. They're inherently communities of connection across those hard borders. So again, the WhatsApp chat groups often connect diasporas to their home environments. And so they're often operating within multiple information environments. And again, the spread of mis and disinformation on these apps circulates and often finds its way through the interpersonal conversations and discussions. And that's kind of another source of information sharing, even though it's not seen or perceived by users as the primary function of the apps. What we found in our research is that these spaces are really incidental sites for the sharing of information. And that said, when information is shared by someone you actually know offline or in real life, and you trust that person and you like that person, some studies from psychology suggest that how you perceive it is also based on how you view them in real life. So if you trust them, you're often also likely to trust the content that they're sharing with you digitally. So it's kind of a way to assess the veracity of digital content shared online. And there's also this natural spread of information, including mis and disinformation, in digital spaces. So there's this upstream and downstream movement of mis and disinformation across platform boundaries and moving across different mediums. So it's often what's called by scholars on mis and disinformation as this cascading logic. And there are studies that show that chat groups and these chat apps are often used to trial balloon certain narratives to see kind of what sticks and what can take off and what can be used to kind of to construct strategic narratives by more adversarial state and non-state actors. So another kind of key point we wanted to understand is that when individual users see mis and disinformation content on these apps, what do they do with it? So we actually asked how individuals respond to disinformation on chat apps. And what this kind of colorful bar graph shows in short is mostly people do nothing. So let's unpack that a little bit. And what we found is that most people are likely to ignore the content or think about the content, but not necessarily respond. So it's what we call kind of passive engagement. There's this kind of passive engagement to disinformation. And individuals suggested they ignore it or they just think about it, but they don't necessarily respond. When they do respond, what was interesting is that they still tend to respond by disagreeing with the content. So it's not that individuals will agree with the content. If they choose to respond, they disagree with it. So we kind of gauged this. This is kind of why it's so important for us as researchers to adopt mixed method approaches, because the survey kind of highlighted these trends. And then we decided to pick them up in our focus group discussions to kind of uncover some of the mechanisms behind these decisions that individuals make in terms of when they decide to counter and engage with mis and disinformation. And what we found is through our focus group discussions is that there was a few more insights that we were able to gain as researchers in terms of why there's this selective and passive engagement. One is there's kind of sheer problem of volume of information circulating in all digital spaces that individuals engage in. So there's kind of this exhaustion from the sheer volume of incoming information, and individuals often feel that they feel overwhelmed at an individual level, or they feel like the idea of engaging with mis and disinformation and countering and correcting it is often too cumbersome. There's just too much circulating that it's an uphill and futile battle. So that was kind of one of the experiences shared across the communities that we chatted with in our focus group discussions. And then also there's a differential burden of labor for these communities. They also indicated to us in their focus groups that they're fighting mis and disinformation that targets their communities, and they're also fighting mis and disinformation narratives and content that's circulating within their communities. So individuals indicated that they have to be selective. They have to choose to selectively engage to kind of maintain their own individual peace and emotional well-being. That said, in our focus group discussions, we did uncover that there are a lot of stories of digital agencies. And as much as we talk about the problem of mis and disinformation, I think as researchers, when we actually talk to individuals, we were very buoyed and optimistic with some of the creative tactics that they used in their day-to-day lives to tackle and counter mis and disinformation. So there were often creative strategies for these digital spaces that included correcting mis and disinformation circulating and moving it from online spaces to offline. So Auntie shared something in the WhatsApp chat group, a family chat group. I'm not going to call it out there, but guess what? That night I picked up the phone, I called her, and we discussed it. Or I moved it to a one-to-one chat and shared credible, authoritative news articles on the subject. There's also an awareness of how these digital spaces are sometimes surveilled and censored. This especially arose in our discussions with members belonging to the Chinese diaspora, and their awareness discuss and broach on WeChat and what was not, and the kind of very heightened awareness that what they discuss on WeChat will not only be censored and surveilled, but may also have implications if in real life, not just for themselves, but also for loved ones back home. So again, a lot of stories of this kind of digital agency. We also found that individuals use unique kind of cognitive shortcuts or heuristics in these digital spaces. So they use things like what chat group was the information shared in, because that particular chat group is known to have a lot of junk news and garbage sharing on that. So I ignore what's shared on that. They also use the credibility of the sender. Like, so individuals who send content develop sort of a reputation as either a credible sender or one that lacks credibility. And interestingly, technological interventions like forwarded many times, these are a bit more ambiguous and are read differently by different subpopulations within the diaspora community. So for example, on WhatsApp, there's the forwarded many times. By younger users, that tended to be a flag, like a yellow light, this content may not be valid and accurate. For older users, it was like, check, this information's been shared so much that maybe it's valid and good, and I'm just going to pass it along. So it was interesting to see that those content moderation interventions track differently within subpopulations in these digital spaces. And then, of course, we wanted to understand the impacts of disinformation. And again, I shared some of the individual level impacts, but what you see is across the board, the spread of mis and disinformation is impacting these communities in unique and different ways. 51% of our respondents reported experiencing some amount of marginalization as a result of online mis or disinformation. 46% experienced some degree of hate as a result of mis and disinformation. And 44% kind of reported feeling a certain amount of emotional impacts or emotional harms. So again, at the individual level, you have that exhaustion from information pollution, the fact that people are just very much tired of all this information that's constantly coming their direction on different platforms, including private chat apps. And there's also these kind of barriers and constraints for these communities when countering mis and disinformation, and that includes these cultural dynamics. So in focus group discussions, what we found and heard was that stories of sometimes I want to respond, but I cannot because it's not considered respectful for me to call out my elder member in the family on the chat group. So again, this is when they would often come up with these creative strategies to engage and overcome these kind of cultural barriers and dynamics. And again, the decision of when to intervene is often based on the nature of the chat group and who the sender is. But all of this suggests is that there's a lot of burden of disinformation labor for these communities. Like, think about all these processes they're going to in terms of assessing the quality of the information, deciding when and how to engage, and then kind of circumventing and navigating all these different barriers, whether it's concerns of surveillance and censorship, or whether it's concerns about cultural dynamics and sensitivities to those dynamics. And then at the collective and group level, what we heard in focus groups is that the idea of that layered experience, right? There's disinformation circulating within their communities that they're trying to target and trying to counter, but there's also disinformation that's circulating that targets them as a community, that targets their group. And again, within our discussion of hate, 46% said they experienced some hate. And within our communities, what we found is the Chinese population reported experiencing more increases in discrimination and prejudice than the sample as a whole. So again, some diasporas are affected even differently than others. And that's consistent also with our previous round of focus groups that talked about anti-Asian hate during the COVID pandemic. So again, they're also dealing with mis and disinformation that targets their communities. And even the mis and disinformation that targets their communities, even that's a layered experience because they're often experiencing mis and disinformation emanating from home countries, but then they're also experiencing mis and disinformation that's domestically circulating within Canada that are kind of sort of sometimes anti-immigrant, Islamophobic, anti-Asian, and kind of xenophobic kind of tropes and narratives that are picked up by some fringe ideological movements and so forth. So that it's a really complicated kind of layered experience of the impacts of disinformation, and it really impacts their day-to-day lives, as including how they alter and modify their digital behaviors. And I'll throw it back to Besma to kind of go over some of the broader implications and zoom out on why some of this matters.
Yeah, thank you. Just go to the, oh, good. Thank you for switching the slide. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot obviously that could come from this, but some of the top implications we thought about, you know, we do focus a lot on elections as a community and completely understand why we do that. And it's really important that we do. But we also really are conscious of this idea of everyday disinformation. So it's not just every 4 years or 5 years. It's really about that constant slow drip of disinformation and how it shapes opinions and public perceptions between elections. So it's, you know, very much in keeping with the everyday threats of surveillance, censorship, potential harms that could come, you know, to folks and their loved ones. And we heard that quite a lot with the Chinese diaspora community as well. And just basically how this shapes and alters everyday digital behavior and practices. It really effectively creates this chilling effect, and particularly in some communities more than others. There's obviously information pollution. And again, to the previous point, Shelley noted this sense of exhaustion, being overwhelmed, you know, being overwhelmed with information, we know also produces apathy, decision paralysis. It can also undermine civic engagement, right? I mean, I think if people feel that there's harm that could impact their loved ones, what is the impact on civic engagement here in Canada? It might just actually make people withdraw, and that's really not healthy for our sense of belonging, and nor for, I think, the very overall health of our entire political system. We do think there is a potential for radicalization and increased polarization, and that really happens from the echo chambers and the filter bubbles. We already know that there's algorithmic biases at work. A lot of this radicalization is increasingly towards a right wing or alt-right wing, to be exact. You know, there's these unfortunate, you know, white replacement theory. I mean, there's a whole host of them that are really pretty ugly, and interestingly, even coming into some of the ethnocultural communities. I mean, we see this with, if I may say as an example, not a Canadian one, but, you know, looking at Trump's, you know, cabinet. I mean, there is a lot of, you know, South Asians in the cabinet, and we increasingly seeing that actually this is not, and how they justify what is, you know, to many of us, you know, very racist type policies. And there is a very interesting way that some of this disinformation is also being almost adapted, right, to these ethnocultural communities' own cultural sort of, you know, whether it's superiority for them or even just their experiences, and this very interesting othering, let's just say, that we see in all these communities as a result. Of course, you know, there's a democratic trust deficit happening. So, you know, people have, and we see this in lots of external polling, you know, less faith in institutions, parties, the media, and so forth. And of course, that trust gap therefore widens, and again, is a real disservice to democracies writ large. As far as the impact on public opinion and narratives, we see that there is a lot of ways of, you know, priming, framing, agenda setting that is, you know, really important to study as a part of this. We certainly know that disinformation effects aren't universal. We see that, again, the subpopulations or ethnocultural communities have this double burden, and that also women and, you know, members of the LGBTQ plus community would also face more of this kind of double burden, stigmatization and discrimination. Again, differential impacts for communities is, you know, in many ways for these communities seen as a threat that they have to think about. We saw this in our first project as well, where a lot of the ethnocultural organizations that we used as really interlocutors in our study really talked a lot about how, they're very conscious of this, and they're going to have to, and it's ironic because we're of course seeing less and less funding, committed to these organizations, but oftentimes they're at the front lines trying to work with their communities and say, like, that's not true, this is disinformation. And it's tough because they're going against oftentimes, if not foreign governments, which we can't prove, but just this really strong presence of, alternative facts, if you will, that's what they call it, that is really just disheartening and not healthy to our overall information environment. And certainly we know that foreign actors are a part of the problem. We do know that they are fueling disinformation campaigns. We see that in some of the reporting, even at the Canadian government level. We know that there are targeted disinformation campaigns to certain ethnocultural community diaspora. It can lead to xenophobia, discrimination, and racism. And I think there's also a lot of attempt and burden, as I said, on the communities to really counter and correct this disinformation. And we see this with a lot of harm. We saw this with health disinformation during COVID, and how they, positioned this virus and the disinformation that we saw in some cases, which we haven't had a chance to completely measure, but may have changed, behaviors and some of the uptake of vaccines. And certainly conspiracy theories are a part of that. So this really takes us to our last slide and thinking about what's next. Admittedly, we are at the sort of tail end of our funding. So, we're always very interested in trying to think about what's next. We do know that we've really been able to uncover a lot of great data. We do want to sort of expand our understanding of how this relates to foreign interference and misdisinformation. Again, Shelley's really taking a lot of the lead and work on that in terms of her presentations to the Foreign Interference Committee. We do want to think about beyond the legal regulatory frameworks and tech responses. Those are, in our view, really top-down solutions, like content warnings. And I think, when we're talking about the kinds of spaces we're looking at that are supposedly encrypted, they really require a different tool. There are some folks, unfortunately, in the United States are talking about creating a backdoor. We really don't want to go there because we're really conscious of what that means for civil liberties. But I think there are mechanisms that can be used on the regulatory side. Again, that's something we'd love to think about. Whether, I think good old-fashioned digital literacy is always a safe investment. It never hurts. The more, the better. And that will really build the resiliency that we see and need. But I'll go, again, in terms of, what the ethnocultural communities need to be resilient, it may be different. And I think that's important. So they need funding. And of course, that means the importance of third language resources. I'll just really make a shout out to our last set of funding from the Heritage Canada, which we are investing in actually something very different for Shelley and I, is actually creating these kinds of resources and tools. So we've got films, little short videos, advertisements that we're going to put on things like Omni Network to get the message out in local languages. So that's part of our sort of next steps in what we're doing. And yes, want to thank you very much for listening to us.
Thank you, everyone.
Fascinating stuff, and it's at the best point of the presentation now because it's over to the audience to ask questions. We invite you to put any questions or comments you might have. We dive into what's coming in on the chat though. I'm just a little bit curious about what it is that makes these kinds of spaces different. If you would mind sort of explaining a little bit more about what it is that's special about these particular spaces.
Esma, did you want me to take it?
Go for it.
Okay. So the way we like to think about it is kind of, they're unique and different in multiple ways. One, they're unique in kind of how mis and disinformation spreads. And that's where those like interpersonal connections really come into play. And these, like, we see it in our research with those cognitive shortcuts of how individuals assess the quality of information is a little bit different than how they assess it in places like Facebook or, even more so Twitter/X, where there's a lot more anonymity with information being shared. So your guard may be up in a different way in those spaces versus how they are in, like, let's say, a chat group with 5 of your best friends, or a chat group with family members who you know and respect. So there's a difference in that way. There's also a difference in terms of accessing these apps as researchers, right? There are logistical questions and challenges of how to access them. There are methodological barriers and how to research them and study them. And then there's ethical concerns, because you do want to make sure that we protect individual rights to privacy, anonymity, and so forth. And then, of course, there's kind of a key difference in what you can do with mis and disinformation circulating in these spaces. It's not that easy to throw on a content warning about something that's shared on a chat app, and that there's not much of an appetite, nor should there be, for kind of that external like surveillance and censoring of content in these apps, because they are seen as safe places. And we do need safe digital places where individuals can sometimes engage in free exchange of ideas that are, what we call, like, what the public policy world calls awful but lawful. And that also, it's important to have those kind of outlets for individuals to share ideas. And that's where democratic discourse happens. That's where kind of our liberal political institutions can grow and get a gut check in terms of what's working and what's not. It creates some accountability in terms of that democratic free exchange of ideas. So what we can actually do, the policy responses for these spaces are also different than, let's say, places like Facebook and Twitter, where we can demand more from big tech to do more. But in these spaces, you probably actually don't really want big tech in your DMs.
Besma, did you have anything to add to that? Wonderful. So let's pop on to the first question that we have from the audience here. And we've been asked, we often talk about echo chambers created by recommender algorithms in social media. Even if that's not true for encrypted chat apps, echo chambers have existed long before social media. Do you think that the hindrances to debunking disinformation creates echo chambers? In that case, would having larger groups or channels mitigate the risks of these echo chambers by acting as de facto social media?
It's a great question. I mean, it could have a diluting effect, right? The larger it is, the more dilution could be the case. So certainly, I think there's some kind of warranted view in that, but I don't think it's something you can sort of, you can't implement that in a way, right? I mean, WhatsApp's not going to say, you can't have more than, you can't have a minimum of 50 users in a chat group, right? So I think that it's good. It's just hard to enforce. Absolutely, right? I mean, we know. I mean, there's a famous saying in medicine, dilution is the solution to pollution, right? In the sense of, yes, absolutely. Whenever you dilute something, you'll have less toxicity. So yeah, I agree that the mechanism would work, but it's just a matter of how would you implement it.
I also think there's a concern, like, and this comes from being biased from studying ethnocultural diasporas who are racialized, that sometimes we talk about echo chambers, and we have to also understand that members of these communities are often on the receiving end of the idea of, like, freedom of speech and expression, and that often opens up kind of disproportionate levels of targeting through things such as, like, stigmatization, discrimination, hate-based information sharing, and so forth. So I think we have to also be really cognizant of the fact that democratizing digital information spaces is not always going to be uniformly and universally dispersed.
We'll get to our next question from the audience in a moment, and I encourage people to send in your questions because these answers are fascinating. In the meantime, though, I wanted to just dig in on what you mentioned as passive engagement. For a long time, marketers and promoters have made use of product placement and jingles and placing logos on billboards so that they're just passively around us for the reason that they help drive sales. I just wonder if you'd like to sort of dig into what's actually happening with the people who believe that they're not doing anything, but you framed as passive engagement, because I think that's very, very important and interesting.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's where I think the survey, the way the questions are, we're somewhat limited with our survey instruments in the sense of questions we word it a certain way, and it often gets interpreted another way. And interestingly, people thought they weren't engaging with content. And then when we had those focus group discussions, we found they actually did, but they didn't even realize they were. And I think what is unique about these spaces is I think a lot of the reason they don't even realize individuals realize they're countering and correcting information is because of that interpersonal connection on these apps. So we started to conceive of these chat groups as really like first and foremost as communities of connection. And I think that also provides a lot of optimism for future responses for mis and disinformation. That perhaps rather than the big public facing platforms where people are anonymous and hiding behind that anonymity to sometimes be mean and nasty, in these communities of connection on these chat groups, their behavior is quite different because you do know them, you do think of them, or even if you don't know them directly, you're in a chat group with friends who know each other. So there's all these like, 5-6 degrees of separation, but there's some connection between individual users on these apps. And I thought that was interesting because if we just looked at the survey data, we would think, oh, people aren't doing much about mis and disinformation in these spaces, but that those really like rich qualitative insights that came from our focus group actually kind of filled in the blanks from the survey. And actually, there is a lot of work that's being done. I think the question really becomes, how can we play a supportive and productive role for individuals to feel empowered in these digital spaces to engage more?
We'll take another question from our audience, and thank you very much for the question. Should there be regulatory frameworks that force digital providers to be responsible for content on their platform? They seem to be abandoning any responsibility at this point for misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah, Besma, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think there is a responsibility. Like any product and service, we need to be really mindful that, we have very strong, regulatory, challenges or sorry, not say challenges, sorry, barriers or guardrails on any service and product. This is no different. And I always look at it's a matter of like, what if we understood better the harm that could be made, right? With any product or service, as long as there's harm, there needs to be regulation. I mean, that's just I think a part of logic, and I think there is a lot of harm that can be in place, and I think today we are more conscious than ever that social media is not just social. It can be used as a potent tool. It can be weaponized. It can be absolutely manipulated. And so we need to be conscious of that. The challenge, of course, and I think where we always want to be mindful is that balancing act between, freedom of speech, and ensuring that we also protect civil liberties, but not letting, the platforms to get away with anything. And I think there's a very delicate balance there. And certainly what works in Canada may not work in the United States, which tends to lean far more towards, free speech as a principle. And so we'll always be butting heads against the Americans on this. And certainly we see that mostly with the Europeans, who have been very, very good, in my humble view, on really thinking about this in a sensitive manner that I don't think impinges on free speech, but is absolutely careful about these social media and the entire sort of, landscape of internet tools and the rest, and connectivity of how it can be used to ensure that society is resilient and not harmed, and certainly thinking about it in terms of data, which is the way the European Union has framed it. So I think we could use some of that, but I would be remiss if I said I had the answer, because I think it also requires that kind of public debate in a way that's sensitive to a host of communities. And one thing I think we've recognized and we've grown to appreciate is just the differentiated impact. And so, for some individuals, the more free speech, the better, because likely they're not going to be harmed in terms of their positionality versus, again, I think as women, we're very conscious of this because we see it. Unfortunately, we know women experts are going to be doxxed, are going to face far more horrendous commentary in their comments to them in a way that men don't experience. And that's just one of many, many different, differentiated identities that could impact, the kind of discourse that they're facing. So yes, is my long-winded answer.
And also, just to kind of add some nuance, is that the legal regulatory responses can't be kind of like a one size fits all for these different platforms, because they are so different and unique. And you see that between like the public facing versus the kind of these private chat apps. So that said, it's also really hard for the legal regulatory responses to keep up, because there's always the technology itself and the platforms themselves are always constantly evolving. When we started our research, like TikTok was nothing. And within 3 years, it's now a main information source for the younger demographics. So it's constantly evolving, and sometimes the legal regulatory responses are needed, but they're always almost going to be playing catch up. So they have to also be complemented by other strategies, like investing in these kind of grassroots strategies, using civil society organizations, partnering with these sort of trusted intermediaries between government, technology, individual users. So I think it really has to be what we call not just a whole of government approach, but also a whole of society approach.
You noted in your presentation sort of the popularity of different platforms, and I couldn't help but noticing that if I combined a few of them together, Instagram, WhatsApp, Facebook, that are all owned by the same company, that is a considerable proportion of the media that's being used among these communities. And also noting that recently this group has decided to change how they're going to manage content moderation, aspiring to a free speech approach, shall we say, but in practice changing to a community-driven moderation type model. Just wondering your thoughts about how those changes could impact the future within these communities, and whether that type of model opens up these platforms for additional types of misuse, and the moderation system itself being misused as a tool rather than as a government's framework that works as explained by the policy documents put out.
Yeah, and I'm mindful of something that I heard, and I apologize, I'm forgetting her name, the Facebook whistleblower, who talked about the lack of content moderation, particularly in foreign languages, and that English was overrepresented because they were generally afraid of lawsuits. So overrepresentation in the Anglosphere, because particularly the United States, because they're just afraid of being sued. But in the sense of, and again using kind of market fundamentals, they had almost no content moderators in some languages, and so the pollution that was in some of these these Facebook pages was incredible, and that in her humble view was a part of what led to the genocide of the Rohingya, or the attempted, because the messaging that was found in Myanmar was atrocious and completely unregulated and unmoderated. So already we've seen, again, a lot of ethnocultural communities who are not writing in English already at a disadvantage in terms of getting less content moderators. So I shudder to think about what's happening now with Meta's new change in policy, which, I mean, it really becomes a free-for-all. We've seen what can happen when, again, there's so much disinformation in the on these platforms.
Yeah, I mean, it really feels like it's kind of a David versus Goliath type situation when big tech starts to remove some of the protections. And even in private encrypted chat apps, there's a few kind of technological interventions and tools that are relatively easy to implement, that are kind of don't harm certain subpopulations more than others. And that's like even in chat groups, the ability to forward it to a certain number of people. Even that kind of slows down the spread of mis and disinformation in these spaces. So there are those kind of interventions that you would hope don't leave these digital spaces. I mean, in terms of our research and discussions with individual users belonging to these communities, as well as community organizations and civil society organizations that represent these communities in Canada, what we found is there's also skepticism of what big tech interventions will do to them as a community. And that's again rooted in the longer history of being securitized and surveilled, even by their home countries. So oftentimes there's a hesitation of, no, you know what, we don't actually want government really involved in these chats, and we don't really want big tech involved in these chats. We'll deal with the problem of mis and disinformation as a community and on the individual level. That said, from a normative perspective, it just is unfair.
I'm gonna ask you to attempt what I consider to be impossible, if you don't mind, and that is migrant and diasporic communities straddle a number of news environments, a number of cultures, the sets of forces that are at play on them in terms of influence and motivation are overlapping and multidimensional. It seems to be an incredibly complex environment that's very much different from that which a person who was born and lived in a single country and community interfaces with. I was wondering if you could give some kind of window into a world where people are straddling news and social pressures between different countries, and perhaps the role that push and pull between your different community groups and your different social groups online, and the trust between different organizations might play in pushing people left and right and up and down, a little bit of what that washing machine of online environment might feel like for the people who are exposed to it.
Basma, do you want to attempt to tackle? Okay. Okay. So this is a great question. And I mean, I think many of the individuals who participated in our survey and our focus groups, that this is their lived reality every day. And through our focus group discussions, we learned that this kind of layered information environment, one, it increases the sheer volume of content you're exposed to, and it also increases the range of content that you're exposed to, because you're not just only embedded in the North American information environment, you're also embedded in, let's say, what's happening in India. And oftentimes individuals indicated that they tend to be more interested in those topics as well. So there's that complexity. And then even within diaspora communities, there's a lot of variation, right? So within the Indo-Canadian diaspora, there's often what's happening in India in terms of some of our data collection from our previous project overlapped with the onset of a large farmers movement that kind of took over the capital and was a real challenge to the dominant Hindu Nationalist Party in power, the BJP, led by Narendra Modi. And what we found in that wave of data collection was that it was also having real impacts for the Indo-Canadian diaspora. And they were actually kind of, it was kind of like, you know, they were having debates on the topic between, let's say, those who came from more agrarian states versus those who did not, which are often overlapping with religious divisions and linguistic divides. And so there was a real debate happening, and often very tense debates. What we found in our research was that these civil society organizations that represent these communities would often intervene in ways that would foster more social cohesion, but also allow this debate to happen constructively and productively. And I think that's a testament to kind of the liberal, democratic, multicultural model we have in Canada, where we allow for this space to happen and not just a pure kind of assimilation. And what we found from our community partner organizations is they created a virtual town hall where they called experts who kind of represented both sides, and they had a very healthy debate, a question and answer period, and for their membership, and it was really well received. So I think it's challenging, but I think what we find most optimistic is when we see those community-based responses. And what's hard is these responses are really bespoke. They're really, you know, culturally specific and temporally specific and contextually specific as well. But when you see that, it kind of just reinforces the idea that we need to invest in these type of connections in society more, in these civil society kind of interconnections, interactions, and connections.
Wonderful answer. Thank you very much. Our time has come to a close, so we'll let everybody get back to their afternoons. I'd like to thank very much Dr. Shalikai Bahaj and Dr. Besma Mamani. Thank you very much for your time and your research. I would also like to thank our audience for their wonderful questions and remind them that there'll be another webinar next month and invite them to join us then. So with that, thank you very much.